Okay, let's just dive right in. Why is it still so incredibly awkward, I mean really awkward, for adults to talk about sex? Even for us sometimes, isn't it?
It really can be.
Like, I still remember being a kid, maybe 10 or 11, watching some movie, and there was some nudity on screen. My face just burned.
Oh, yeah.
I felt this huge wave of shame and confusion just wash over me, and absolutely no one around me said a single word, didn't explain a thing.
Total silence.
Yeah, they just pretended everything was normal.
Yeah.
Like my blushing was the problem,
Yeah.
not the deafening silence around the whole thing. It felt like this secret language I didn't get, and no one was even offering a dictionary.
That feeling, that sense of a secret, something you just don't mention, it's really deeply ingrained in many societies. It's a collective issue. And
Yeah.
it's particularly notable in Ukrainian society, for example, which is the context for some of the source material we're looking at today. There's this pervasive weakness in sexual education, really stretching from childhood right through adulthood. And it leaves adults grappling with really fundamental questions they feel way too embarrassed to ask.
And that lack, that silence from childhood, that's exactly what this deep dive is all about, isn't it? We're taking a whole stack of sources provided by you, our listener, to really unpack adult sex education. Kind of fill in those gaps, understand what we missed, and figure out what we need to know now.
Yeah, the essentials.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
We'll be looking at fundamental concepts like libido, the absolute non-negotiable importance of consent, what passion even is, how we navigate our desires, and crucially, how to finally talk about all of this stuff openly, without that crushing discomfort or anxiety.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, think of this as like a therapeutic, friendly conversation, a space to explore these ideas together. We really hope it's genuinely useful for you.
Well, my own background includes researching how psychosexual development courses are formed and implemented for kids and teens in different countries. And when you look at places where this kind of education is integrated developmentally, like right from first grade, you see such a stark contrast.
Huge difference, I bet.
Yeah, children learn age-appropriate information, starting with things like body safety, boundaries, understanding emotions, building this foundation of comfort and knowledge.
Right, built up.
Exactly. Of course, the topics change with age. First graders aren't learning about, genital penetration or anything like that.
Obviously.
But there's a structure, a logical progression of understanding yourself and relationships, whereas we often had nothing structured at all, just silence or awkwardness.
Exactly. Nothing. Or worse, weird misinformation. And as I've personally started exploring this topic more, talking to friends, reading, and especially reflecting on the sources for this deep dive, I realized just how many personal insights there were for me. So many things I really wish I'd known earlier. So many points of just deeply ingrained taboo, so much negativity wrapped around the whole topic, and this pervasive idea that sex is somehow secondary, almost an afterthought, or just the apogee, the peak moment of a relationship, something that only happens like strictly after marriage.
And that last point you made, it's particularly problematic, and the sources really highlight it powerfully.
Right.
The idea that sex must wait until marriage completely ignores the crucial reality of sexual compatibility.
Totally.
You can meet someone absolutely wonderful, intellectually stimulating, emotionally supportive, and just be completely incompatible sexually. And that incompatibility, if you don't address it, can really erode the relationship, even if everything else feels perfect.
Yeah, it becomes this elephant in the room.
Exactly. And this discomfort, it can stem from so many things mentioned in the sources, feeling uncomfortable with a partner's body shape, maybe their body smells don't quite work for you, different levels of libido, fundamentally different needs, or even what psychologists call sexual accentuations, basically, preferred forms of arousal or activity.
Wow, okay. So many potential mismatches.
Yeah.
All these things that if you don't talk about them, if you don't understand them, can become huge roadblocks. Which brings us to our goal for today. We want to cover at least the basic foundational concepts from these sources. Give you a starting point of vocabulary, and maybe just permission to think about these things without shame. We know this topic is just vast.
Oh, incredibly vast. I mean, I've been lecturing on this material, psychosexual development and health, for years, and I'm constantly adding new insights, new examples from clinical practice, ongoing research. It never ends.
I believe it.
But we can absolutely break down some core components today that feel particularly relevant for adults who feel like they're kind of starting from scratch.
Okay, good. Let's unpack this then. Starting with something that came up in your lectures, something I realized many adults don't fully grasp the depth of based on observing those discussions. libido. What is libido, really? I mean, beyond just sex drive.
Okay, well, a classic definition, one originating with Freud, actually describes libido as the psychic energy, this fundamental life force that humans use for expression in the world.
Right, like a general energy.
Exactly. And yes, a significant part of that energy is directed towards sexuality. But to simplify it for our purposes here, libido is essentially your personal level of sexual need, your innate sexual drive or
Your
resource.
special fuel, as one source kind of put it. Not just for sex, but for living, for doing things.
Exactly that. And it's fascinating the sources and honestly clinical experience strongly suggest that the level of sexual need often correlates quite directly with your overall desire and capacity to express yourself broadly in the world.
Huh. Interesting.
When we suppress or repress or kind of package away our sexuality, when we ignore that fundamental energy, we can also inadvertently suppress our ability to fully manifest ourselves, to be dynamic and engaged in other areas of life, work, creativity, social interactions. It's almost like trying to run a car on half a tank because you're afraid to use all the fuel.
Wow, that makes so much sense. If a core, really powerful part of your energy is being blocked or denied, it's going to ripple out, isn't it? Affect
Mhm.
the whole system, your whole ability to kind of put yourself out there. So what influences this level of libido? Is it fixed or
Uh,
does it change?
Oh, many factors influence it, and no, it's generally not fixed, though it definitely has baseline tendencies for each person. Stress, for example, that can significantly lower libido for some people, make them feel totally shut down sexually when they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, I can see that.
But surprisingly for others, stress can actually raise it.
Really?
Yeah, illness too, physical or mental, can cause it to fluctuate dramatically. There's even some indication from research that prenatal testosterone levels might influence our baseline drive or aggression levels before we're even born,
Wow, before birth.
which then connects to our sexual energy later in life.
My own experience with stress, especially during the worst periods of the full-scale invasion here, actually lines with that second possibility. My libido genuinely went up.
Mm.
It felt almost primal, like it was the only way my body could release this intense, overwhelming physical and emotional tension. Like my body was screaming for release when my mind was just overloaded.
That's a very common phenomenon, actually, especially for individuals for whom sex is already a relatively open topic, maybe a recognized resource or a familiar coping mechanism for processing intense states. They can channel or sublimate that emotional and physical tension through sexual expression.
Okay, so it's not totally weird then.
Not at all. So while libido is influenced early, even prenatally, its more settled form, the level you kind of recognize as yours and that you can learn to work with or understand really consolidates somewhere between, say, 18 and 25 years old.
Ah, okay. Late teens, early 20s.
Yeah. That's when you really start to understand what your personal, healthy baseline looks like, your sexual appetite, maybe your level of sexual aggressiveness in a healthy sense.
Aggressiveness again. That word still feels like it might make people pause, especially in the context of sex. Can you elaborate on that link a bit more? Aggression and libido.
Absolutely, because it's really key to understanding this energy. From both a neurophysiological and a psychological perspective, that drive, that assertion of self and desire, is tied to the same underlying energy pool as aggression.
Okay.
But, and this is critically important, sex is an act of aggression in a profoundly ecological form.
Ecological. What does that mean here?
Ecological means it happens without destruction, without harm to yourself or others. It's a powerful, assertive drive, but it's expressed through connection and intimacy.
Ah, I see.
Think about common phrases or desires associated with intense passion. People talk about grabbing, holding tight, even possessing or being taken in a moment of intense desire.
Right, yeah. Those words have power.
They reflect this healthy outlet for what is fundamentally an aggressive energy, but channeled into intimacy. Some sources even mention practices like light, consensual spanking or holding, maybe restraint, during sex as perfectly normal expressions of this drive within the bounds of a typical sexual encounter or what we call a sexual accentuation.
Okay. So it's not about hurting someone. It's about channeling that inherent assertive drive or energy in a way that creates connection and release, not damage. It's about the power of the energy, not its potential for destruction.
Precisely.
But you said that within the bounds of mutual active consent. That sounds like the absolute most crucial boundary marker of all.
Absolutely paramount. Without that mutual, active, enthusiastic consent, it immediately steps outside the realm of ecological expression and straight into harm. It becomes something else entirely. dangerous, destructive.
We will definitely circle back to consent in a massive way because it's just foundational, isn't it?
Completely.
But first, let's tackle another point that seems to spark a lot of debate based on comments we've seen online and just general reactions. The idea that sex is a basic human need. People get so indignant about this.
Ah, yes, the indignation. I know it well. The immediate objection is always, but you can survive without sex.
Right. I'm fine without it.
And academically speaking, yes, you can survive physically without sex. You won't biologically die from a lack of sexual activity in the short term. But the question we should be asking, as the sources provoke, is, can you live a healthy, full psychological life without sex and sexuality?
That's the better question.
Think about not sleeping for 2 or 3 days. You can survive that physically, but are you healthy? Absolutely not. Your cognitive function is impaired, your mood tanks, and in extreme cases, prolonged sleep deprivation can actually kill you. Survival isn't the same as thriving.
Right. Just because your body is technically still functioning doesn't mean you're living a good, healthy, fulfilling life.
Yeah.
And you're saying the academic view, like the consensus in psychology and related fields, actually includes sex in the top tier of basic human needs.
Precisely. It's not some modern invention or a fringe idea from, Cosmo magazine. It's included there for several fundamental reasons that go way beyond mere physical survival.
Okay, like what?
Well, there's the instinctive need for procreation. At the deepest biological level, we are animals wired to reproduce. There's the need for profound emotional satisfaction, pleasure, closeness, connection are powerful motivators and satisfiers deeply tied to sex. There's the release of that energy and resource we discussed, that illogical expression of aggression, and the role it plays in identity and self-expression.
So it fulfills multiple fundamental aspects of being human.
Exactly. Well-being, not just biological perpetuation.
Okay, so moving beyond why it's basic, let's talk about what it even is. Because I think many people, myself included for a long time, have a really narrow definition, often limited to just, well, penetrative sex. And if that's your only definition, you miss out on so much.
And the sources challenge that narrow view directly and explicitly. Sexual interaction, defined broadly, and this is the definition that opens up so much possibility, is really any interaction between two bodies that carries sexual charge or is intended as intimate exploration.
Any interaction.
Pretty much. Kissing, touching, petting, mutual massage. These are all absolutely part of sexual interaction. They're not just foreplay leading to the real thing, quote unquote. They can be the real thing themselves for many people, or just a part of the whole experience.
So even subtle things, like if you're both reaching for the same coffee cup at the same time and your hands brush against each other, depending on the context and the people involved, that could have a sexual charge.
Potentially, yes, depending on the connection between the people, the intent, maybe the history, and the perception. Even accidental touch in a charged moment can be perceived within that broader framework of sexual interaction. The sources do note that flirting, by contrast, is slightly different. It's more of a playful game, an exchange of signals and verbal cues that might lead to sex, but it's distinct from the physical interaction itself.
Right, flirting is the lead-up, the maybe.
It's the dance before the physical connection, if you will.
That broader definition feels so much more inclusive and, well, real and validating, honestly. The sources mention these powerful anecdotes, like someone feeling that just light petting was their most vivid, intense sexual experience, even resulting in orgasm, while maybe penetrative sex was less impactful for them.
Yes, exactly. Or someone for whom deep, intimate kissing is the absolute peak of arousal, maybe more intimate and arousing than intercourse, potentially even leading to orgasm just through that intense connection.
Wow.
This leads us directly to the topic of orgasm and erogenous zones, places on the body that, when stimulated, can lead to arousal and pleasure.
Which, again, I think people have a really limited view of. It's not just the genitals, right?
Right.
And it's not just one way to get there.
Exactly right. Orgasm can be achieved through all sorts of means: manual stimulation, oral stimulation, using sex toys, even purely psychological arousal or the stimulation of non-genital erogenous zones, and in very unexpected places on the body for different people. Back of the knees, neck, ears. It varies hugely.
So much variation.
And it's crucial to highlight, as the sources do, that not everyone, men or women, experiences primary pleasure or reaches orgasm most easily or intensely from penetrative genital sex. For some people, other forms of touch or stimulation are far more effective or pleasurable.
And this is why exploring is so fundamentally important, isn't it? Exploring yourself, understanding your own body, what you like, what feels good, and exploring with your partner, talking about it, searching together for what brings pleasure for both of you.
Yes, looking at all the factors that contribute to arousal and pleasure, the circumstances, is it a quick encounter, a long, intimate night, the location, bedroom, kitchen counter, somewhere else. The types of touch, light, deep, playful, teasing, how
Yeah.
different body parts interact beyond the obvious, even the words spoken.
Words, yeah.
Dirty talk, compliments, expressions of desire, and yes, absolutely fantasies.
Fantasies. Okay, that's a huge one and definitely another area where people often feel shame or confusion.
Hmm.
I know for me, fantasizing about something, whether it's realistic or completely out there, is a big stimulant. It's like a playground for the mind that absolutely impacts the body.
Definitely.
And it's not always about imagining someone else entirely, though the sources explicitly say that fantasizing about people other than your partner, even if you're in a monogamous relationship, is completely normal and often healthy.
It absolutely is normal. It's brain activity, it's thought. It's not necessarily a blueprint for infidelity or a sign something's wrong.
Right. But I've also realized there are fantasies that are just, well, better left as fantasies. For me, anyway. Like thinking about sex on a train or in some very public place felt incredibly arousing as a pure fantasy. The risk, the novelty.
The taboo.
But as soon as I pictured the actual, like, sticky reality, the dirt, the lack of privacy, the potential consequences, the appeal just totally evaporated for me.
That's a very, very common experience. Some fantasies hold their power precisely because they are unattainable or impractical, or exist only in that perfect, controlled mental space where there are no downsides.
Exactly.
The sources even mention that specific fantasy you shared from your reading sex with five dark-skinned men, which the person knew wasn't going to happen, but it was still incredibly arousing. Maybe it is the unattainability, or maybe it's about something deeper the fantasy represents symbolically.
Maybe it is the unattainability that makes it safe and exciting at the same time.
Yeah.
But yeah, the sources and my own reflection totally confirm not all fantasies need to be, or even should be, implemented in real life.
Hmm.
They serve a different purpose sometimes.
No, but they are incredibly worth exploring, acknowledging, and sometimes talking about, especially those that feel a bit outside the norm for you or the ones that keep recurring. Talking about them, even if you never plan to act on them, can be incredibly insightful, both for you and potentially for your partner.
How-
Well, I've had clients share fantasies they initially saw as alien or shameful or really strange, but incredibly arousing. And just describing them in detail, allowing themselves to articulate the specifics without judgment, often helps us uncover the real underlying desire or psychological need that's driving that fantasy.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Can you give another example of that? Like how a fantasy isn't always literal.
Certainly. Like the client I mentioned earlier who shared a recurring fantasy he interpreted as homosexual. He was deeply disturbed by it as he identified strongly as heterosexual.
Okay.
But when he described the fantasy in detail, the setting was this beautiful candlelit dinner with fine wine, deep conversation, intellectual connection, leading eventually to a very tender, intimate encounter. It became clear the fantasy wasn't really about sexual orientation at all.
What was it about then?
It was about missing romance, missing emotional intimacy, feeling truly seen and connected in his current relationship, which had become very pragmatic and almost sexless. Addressing the lack of romance and connection in his actual life resolved the underlying yearning that was being reflected in the fantasy. The fantasy was a metaphor, a symbol for a different kind of hunger.
Wow. That's so powerful.
Mm.
So fantasies aren't always literal blueprints for action. They can be these incredibly rich symbolic keys to understanding deeper psychological needs, maybe emotional hungers, or parts of ourselves we haven't acknowledged. They're worth listening to, even the weird ones.
Precisely. Very much worth listening to. And that brings us beautifully to the absolute cornerstone of any sexual interaction, something mentioned repeatedly and emphasized in the sources as the single most important element: consent.
Yes, this absolutely cannot be stressed enough. Active, enthusiastic consent is paramount. Everything hinges on this.
The source material makes this crystal clear, drawing a very hard line. Spending romantic time together, having a wonderful date, does not automatically equal consent for sex.
Yep.
Kissing passionately for hours does not automatically equal consent for sex. Being naked in bed, cuddling, feeling close, still does not automatically equal consent for sex, or even for any particular form of sex that might happen next.
It's not a given at any stage.
No. Every single touch, every interaction, every single step of intimacy needs active consent, either verbally spoken or clearly non-verbally agreed upon and welcomed by both parties.
And that doesn't always have to be a big, awkward verbal negotiation every single time, right?
Yeah.
Especially once you have established communication with a regular partner. You can develop ways to signal consent or lack thereof more subtly.
Exactly. Couples can definitely establish their own rhythms and cues over time based on trust and knowing each other. Basic things like asking before a first kiss can establish a pattern of checking in that continues. That initial consent might be visual, a nod, leaning in, or it might be verbal, can I kiss you?
Right.
But the fundamental principle always remains. The clear, welcoming permission must be present for each step of physical intimacy. It's always an invitation, never an assumption or an entitlement.
Okay. And what if you're already in the middle of an interaction? Things are getting heated, maybe clothes are coming off, and then you suddenly become uncomfortable. Maybe something happens, or you just change your mind, or you realize you're not actually in the mood anymore.
This is so important. The sources strongly emphasize this, particularly as a message of empowerment, often directed at female listeners who have historically been conditioned, sadly, to prioritize their partner's comfort or desire over their own feelings.
Yeah, that pressure is real.
You have the absolute unconditional right to stop any sexual interaction at any moment if you become uncomfortable, change your mind, or simply no longer want to continue.
Hmm.
It is normal. It is healthy. It is an essential part of caring for yourself and respecting your own boundaries.
I think that's so incredibly important because the pressure can be immense. That feeling of awkwardness, feeling like it's too late to back out now, or feeling this terrible sense of obligation, especially in established relationships or marriage. The sources even mention the damaging historical idea of marital duty, which basically suggests a spouse is owed sex just by virtue of being married. This is such a toxic concept because even within a marriage, consent is always required for each and every instance of sex. No one is ever obligated, ever.
Precisely. The potential trauma, both emotional and even physical, from overriding your own feelings and not saying no out of awkwardness or fear or that perceived obligation is significant and can be really long-lasting. So caring for yourself means understanding and actively exercising that right to stop or to decline an invitation in the first place.
Right.
If you're not ready for a kiss or for sex or for a particular act, but you like the person and the connection, it's perfectly okay and actually necessary to say clearly and kindly something like, hey, I'm really enjoying being with you. Let's slow down a bit. Or I'm not quite ready for this right now. Or maybe, that specific idea isn't really for me.
And you don't even need a big, detailed explanation or excuse, do you? You don't owe anyone a justification for your boundaries.
No, you absolutely do not. As the source states very clearly, you don't always need to explain why you don't want to do something. Your feeling, your boundary, that's enough. You have the full inherent right to your own physical and emotional boundaries. Period.
So the main takeaway, the core principle here, is really shifting sex into a state of active invitation, conscious agreement, and mutual respect for boundaries. Getting rid of the taboo, the secrecy, and that weird sense of suddenness or expectation that often comes from, cultural narratives or maybe bad pornography.
Precisely. This allows for a much healthier, more respectful interaction. It fosters a better understanding of boundaries, both your own and your partner's, and creates a non-judgmental space where desires and limits can actually be discussed openly without fear.
Okay, speaking of desires and limits, let's talk about navigating those within the context of a relationship, especially maybe long-term ones. What happens when partners have conflicting desires, maybe about specific practices or expressions of sexuality? The sources give some really pointed, interesting examples.
They do. Like the scenario they described where a woman really wants dirty talk during sex, wants to be called names, maybe spoken to roughly in that specific consensual context, but her partner absolutely refuses.
Okay.
His reasoning might be something like, I love you and respect you too much, I just can't bring myself to call you bad words. This immediately raises a really important question for the couple. Is this true sexual incompatibility a fundamental difference in what feels arousing or acceptable to each of them? Or is it maybe the partner's rigid moral principle, perhaps something held on too tightly from childhood or cultural conditioning, that is blocking their ability to even explore their partner's desire?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Or this story about Emily Ratajkowski, which was shared in the sources.
Hmm.
She spoke about a partner refusing a desired act. I think it was oral sex, because he felt it would somehow humiliate her.
Yes, I remember that one.
And her reaction, which she was very public about, was basically to leave that relationship. She saw his refusal not as him protecting her, but as him policing her desire based on his own issues or hang-ups. And for her, that was fundamentally incompatible. She needed a partner who accepted her expression.
That illustrates a crucial point from the sources, the vital importance of seeking a partner who is compatible with your particular expression of sexuality, or at the very least is willing to understand and explore it with you within healthy boundaries.
Right, willing to talk and try.
In a truly fulfilling relationship, comfort and compatibility should ideally exist across all levels, not just sex. There's the intellectual or psychological compatibility, right? Having interesting conversations, sharing themes, mutual respect for ideas.
Yeah, the mind connection.
Then there's the emotional or sensual compatibility, being able to share your inner states, feeling closeness, empathy,
A
understanding.
heart connection.
And then there's the physical compatibility, enjoying each other's bodies, maybe their smells, and yes, your partner's specific sexual accentuations or preferred forms of sex. If one of these pillars is missing or consistently uncomfortable, the whole structure feels weaker, less stable.
And this brings us back beautifully to discussing fantasies, but now in a shared context within the relationship. We said not all fantasies need to be implemented, but discussing them together seems key to understanding each other's inner landscape, right?
Absolutely. As I mentioned before with that client example, exploring those seemingly alien but arising fantasies in clinical practice often reveals a deeper, less literal desire that can be met in different ways within the relationship. Remember the client whose homosexual fantasy was actually about missing romance?
Yeah, that was so insightful. It was a metaphor.
Exactly. It pointed towards an unmet emotional need, not a literal sexual orientation conflict.
The sources suggest a very practical, structured technique for couples to explore this potentially tricky space of fantasies together, which helps create safety. The 3 sexual fantasies exercise. Have you used that?
Yes. It's a fantastic tool, really useful for opening this difficult conversation in a contained, manageable way. The ground rules beforehand are absolutely crucial, though.
Like what?
You have to agree explicitly not to judge each other's fantasies, no matter what they are. Just listen with curiosity, try to understand, and then maybe discuss feasibility or reactions later.
Okay, no judgment zone.
Exactly. You sit opposite each other, maybe hold hands if that feels comfortable, create a safe space, and then each person takes a turn sharing 3 fantasies they have, no matter how wild or maybe embarrassing they might feel.
Okay, 3 each.
Afterward, and this is key, you discuss your reactions but focusing entirely on your own feelings. What aroused me about hearing that? What part caused me disgust or discomfort? What caused me apprehension or anxiety? You own your reaction.
And analyzing that anxiety is super important too, right? The sources mention that.
Yeah.
Like, is the anxiety coming from genuine disgust or a hard moral boundary on your part? Or is it maybe coming from an internal block, a fear, or even a suppressed interest that might actually be a source of arousal if you work through it, perhaps in therapy or just through deeper conversation?
Exactly. It's about distinguishing your non-negotiables, your personal red lines, the things you absolutely will not do for any reason, from areas where there might be some room for exploration, understanding, or even overcoming internal barriers together.
Identifying those red lines is key.
Definitely. There was another powerful, detailed therapy case example in the sources about a woman with a lifelong, very persistent rape fantasy.
Oh, wow. That's a complex one.
Extremely. Through careful discussion over time, it emerged that the core desire driving the fantasy wasn't actually about being harmed or violated. It was about the lack of control, the deep yearning for a feeling of being completely possessed, totally free from responsibility and decision-making in that specific sexual moment.
A release from control.
Precisely.
Yeah.
She even tried a literal portrayal, participating in a consensual, carefully controlled porn shoot designed around the theme. But it didn't bring the deep satisfaction the fantasy promised. Why? Because it wasn't actually addressing the underlying psychological need in a relational context.
So the literal wasn't the answer.
No. Later, her best, most fulfilling sexual experiences happened in a relationship with a very respectful partner, where she didn't feel like she constantly had to be the mommy, the one in charge, the planner, the controller. He wasn't controlling or aggressive himself, but he provided this strong framework of security and presence where she felt safe enough to truly release control and surrender in a healthy, trusting way.
Wow. So the fantasy wasn't a literal wish for harm at all, but a really complex symbolic expression of a deep psychological need, a release from the burden of always being in control that could be met in non-literal ways through the dynamic and trust within a healthy relationship. That's incredibly insightful. It shows how complex and symbolic our desires can be.
It really does, and it touches directly on that whole concept of control in relationships and sexuality.
Which is something I relate to so deeply in my own life.
Yeah.
I'm definitely someone who likes control, structure, lists, plans, knowing what's coming. I didn't really start consciously exploring my own sexuality, really understanding my own body and desires, until I was about 24, after a long first relationship ended.
Mm-hmm.
It honestly felt like starting from zero in some ways. It involved literally looking in the mirror, reading books like A Joy of Sex, talking hesitantly to friends, and slowly realizing my own experiences, my feelings, and especially what I didn't know, were very different from what I'd assumed was normal or what maybe other people were experiencing.
A profound process of self-discovery happening maybe later in life compared to what an ideal structured education might provide.
Absolutely. And thinking about my own relationship with control, a friend actually recommended I try a shibari workshop,
Hmm.
the non-sexual Japanese rope binding technique.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I went to a group session, fully clothed, totally non-sexual context. It was purely about the physical experience of being tied, the sensation of the ropes, learning to trust the ropes and the person tying you, and deliberately letting go of control in that very contained physical moment.
Okay.
There was zero sexual activity involved, but that physical sensation, that intentional surrender of control, gave me so many insights into what I actually desired sexually. Specifically, a partner I didn't feel I had to constantly direct or manage, someone who had a strong presence and could take charge in a way that felt safe and exciting, allowing me to finally relax and just be in the moment.
That's a perfect practical example from your own life of how exploration, even completely outside of direct sexual acts, can inform and significantly deepen your understanding of your sexual desires and needs. It's about learning your own body and psyche in different ways.
It really was.
Yeah.
And it made me realize how sometimes fear of losing an emotional connection, fear of damaging the relationship, fear of vulnerability, fear of being judged can lead us to suppress our true desires or just reluctantly agree to things we don't truly want.
Definitely.
When there's no safe interaction, no real dialogue about sex happening in a relationship, that silence and suppression can absolutely kill libido for both partners, can't it? Leading to resentment and distance.
It absolutely can. And tragically, sometimes it leads to couples breaking up over this unspoken incompatibility or lack of intimacy, only for them to find partners later with whom they can discuss and explore their sexuality openly and joyfully. Dialogue, creating that safe space, truly can break down that wall of silence and fear.
Especially now, I think, with all the external stressors like the war impacting our energy levels, our basic sense of safety, and just our overall openness. It can be incredibly hard to feel sexual or open to intimacy when you're constantly stressed or basically in survival mode.
Absolutely. The sources definitely acknowledge that external pressures significantly impact this core area of life. But conversely, fostering that sexual openness where possible, maintaining intimacy, finding fulfillment in this area can significantly improve your overall quality of life. It can provide a vital source of connection, release, and even normalcy, even amidst profound difficulty.
That's a hopeful thought. Now, earlier you mentioned sex and long-term relationships being surprisingly complex, even though theoretically partners know each other so well. Why is that, do you think?
It should be simpler, shouldn't it? On the surface, you know their body, their triggers, their preferences, supposedly. But familiarity can sometimes breed complacency or routine. Couples might stop actively exploring together or continuing to communicate as their desires and bodies inevitably change over time.
Yeah, the people change.
People grow and evolve sexually throughout their entire lives. The sources introduce a really useful distinction here that helps partners talk about nuance, the difference between a fetish and what's more commonly called a kink or maybe a sexual accentuation.
Okay, let's break that down because those terms get thrown around and often misused, I think.
They really are. A fetish, as described in the sources in the psychological literature, is defined quite specifically. It's a zone of arousal without which a person cannot get sufficiently aroused or reach orgasm.
Okay, it's sinful.
It's often object-based, like shoes, specific materials like latex or leather,
Okay.
certain scenarios, and it can be solitary. Someone with a shoe fetish, for example, might be primarily aroused by collecting, wearing, or masturbating to shoes without needing another person present for their arousal or climax. It's essentially a requirement, a dependency for their sexual function.
Right, it's the key that unlocks arousal for them.
Exactly. A kink or a sexual accentuation, on the other hand, is something that brings additional pleasure, significant extra enjoyment, or heightens arousal, but it is not strictly necessary for arousal or orgasm to occur.
So it's like a bonus and enhancer.
Exactly, like certain types of touch, mild forms of role play, specific outfits, or yes, maybe your partner wearing high heels or a certain uniform adds a lot of excitement. It's a boost, an enhancement, maybe a strong preference, but not an absolute requirement for core sexual function with a partner.
So the degree of dependency is the key difference there.
Hmm.
And the sources say if you notice something like this about yourself, whether it feels like a strong accentuation or potentially even a fetish, explore it, understand it, and importantly, it's okay. It's part of human variation.
Yes. Like the example given of a woman mentioned in the sources who was so profoundly aroused by men in sharp business suits that she could potentially reach orgasm just from observing them. For her, the suit was clearly a powerful accentuation, possibly bordering on a fetish depending on whether she needed it present with an actual partner. The main point is these nuances exist within healthy human sexuality. They vary incredibly widely from person to person, and it's normal, even healthy, to explore and understand them about yourself. And if you have a partner you trust, perhaps explore them together, communicate about them.
It really does sound like sexuality, like any significant aspect of ourselves, is a skill or maybe an understanding you develop over your whole life through self-exploration, experience, and definitely communication. I read A Joy of Sex recently, that old classic guide, and it really emphasized that sexuality is a journey, not some fixed destination you arrive at.
It's an excellent book, and it captures that idea perfectly, and it includes these simple but profound anecdotes that just underscore the incredible power of basic communication. Like the story you mentioned earlier of the woman who came into therapy complaining bitterly that her husband didn't understand or guess her sexual desires after years and years of marriage.
Yeah.
And the therapist's seemingly obvious suggestion was devastatingly simple. Have you tried just telling him?
And boom.
Yeah.
It apparently resolved their issues and improved the relationship quality across the board, not just sexually. It seems almost ridiculously simple, but that dialogue is often the hardest part, isn't it? How do you actually bring up these potentially sensitive desires or curiosities to a long-term partner respectfully without it sounding like a critique or a "you don't satisfy me" complaint?
That's the absolute core challenge of sexual communication in established relationships, for sure. The sources suggest a really powerful technique that's applicable across almost all relationship conversations, not just sex. Use I messages.
Ah, the classic "I feel" statement.
Exactly. Instead of starting with "you never do X" or "I don't like when you do Y," which immediately puts the partner on the defensive, you frame it around your internal state, your feelings, your desires. You say, "I feel, I want, I fantasize about."
Okay, so frame it around your internal world and your longings, not a judgment or critique of them or the relationship.
Precisely. Imagine that couple who's only had missionary sex for years. The woman listens to our deep dive, reads the sources, and thinks, okay, I want more exploration. I really want to try new things. Instead of saying, our sex life is boring, we only ever do missionary, which is accusatory and likely to shut things down.
Yeah, defense mode immediately.
Right. She approaches her partner using I messages. Listen, you are incredibly important to me. You're my partner, and I love our connection, our life together. Everything feels really good on so many levels, but I've been thinking a lot about my own sexuality lately, and I've realized I really want to try something new. I fantasize about X kind of sex, maybe describing a different position, or oral sex, or using a toy. I really want to explore these possibilities with you. This is what I want for my own sexual journey and for us. What do you think and feel about that? What are your desires or curiosities?
Ah, starting from your own desires and feelings, taking ownership of them, and then explicitly inviting their response and perspective. That feels so much safer, more open, and way less confrontational than making a demand or lodging a complaint. It's about growing together, not pointing out a deficiency.
Precisely. It shifts the entire conversation from blame or criticism to shared exploration and mutual understanding. It opens the door instead of slamming it.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. The sources also touch on different relationship structures, like open relationships or open marriages. This is definitely another area that sparks a lot of curiosity and sometimes, frankly, a lot of judgment.
Yes, and they share a really fascinating perspective based on observation and clinical experience that people in consensually non-monogamous relationships, specifically focusing on open marriages, can often be remarkably warm, deeply connected, and genuinely secure in their primary bond.
Really. That seems counterintuitive to some people.
It can seem that way, but the idea is that the freedom they have, the permission to explore sexual connections outside the primary relationship under very specific, carefully negotiated, agreed-upon rules actually seems, paradoxically, for some couples, to deepen their appreciation for the core bond they actively choose to maintain and prioritize every day.
That makes a lot of sense, actually.
Yeah.
That the freedom and active choice remove the element of feeling trapped or owned. It shifts the focus from obligation or exclusivity being the sole definition of love to conscious choice and deep connection being the core.
Exactly.
I've had a brief personal experience with exploring an open format relationship myself a while ago, and it actually evolved naturally into a closed one as the closeness with that specific partner grew deeper. The sources point out, and this resonated with me, that having the freedom or the permission to explore doesn't necessarily mean you're constantly exercising it outside the primary relationship. Sometimes just knowing it's okay is enough.
Right. It's often the knowledge that you could and the shared agreement and permission that holds the power. The security comes from the transparency and the active, ongoing communication. Communication is absolutely key, non-negotiable in these structures. Partners must have explicit, sometimes very difficult and uncomfortable conversations about their comfort levels, their boundaries, their fears, their desires, before acting on any external attractions or desires.
Like really specific rules.
Often, yes. What are the rules? Is it just sex? Or are emotional connections allowed? With whom? Where? When? How much information is shared? These require constant, often challenging dialogue and revisiting. It's not easier, it's just different.
Another point the sources raised that I found really interesting and liberating is the whole idea of when a relationship actually starts. Is it after the first kiss, the first time you have sex, the first date? Society has all these weird implicit rules.
Yes.
But the sources cut through all the external expectations by simply stating everyone invents for themselves what being in a relationship is.
Which is incredibly liberating, isn't it? But also maybe a bit daunting for some.
Totally.
It means there are no universal rules dictated by society or tradition that you have to follow. What constitutes a relationship? What are the expectations within it? What is acceptable or unacceptable? The individuals involved must define and agree on this for themselves.
And this leads directly into how we define cheating or infidelity, doesn't it?
Logically, yes. Drawing from that previous point, the sources define infidelity not as some universally defined act like having sex with someone else is always cheating. Infidelity is breaking the specific, explicit, or sometimes implicitly understood, but preferably explicit, agreements or boundaries that that specific couple has made for their unique relationship.
Ah, okay. It's about the agreement.
Exactly. If no agreement exists about something like, say, liking certain photos on Instagram, or having dinner alone with an ex, or regular seemingly innocent texting with someone else, but there are unspoken expectations floating around, that's where conflict and feelings of betrayal arise. Nothing is technically cheating in that relationship until it's been agreed upon as a boundary that was then violated.
So cheating isn't a universal objective thing defined by external rules. It's a violation of the private, custom-made contract between two specific people.
Exactly. And that's why communication about these boundaries is so critical from the start. And couples handle infidelity, the breaking of those agreements, in vastly different ways. Some instances lead irrevocably to breakup, the trust is shattered. Some couples, surprisingly maybe, manage to work through the intense pain and the breach of trust together. And the intensive dialogue required to heal can actually forge a stronger, more honest bond in the end.
Well,
Some couples, in the aftermath, even transition to a consensually non-monogamous structure, establishing entirely new agreements about external sexual or emotional connections going forward. The common thread for any path towards healing or resolution, though, is dialogue addressing the pain caused directly, understanding the why, and making new, clear agreements based on present needs and boundaries.
speaking of different experiences and structures of being,
Yeah.
the sources also mention asexuality and aromanticism. I only recently really learned, through a friend's experience actually, that asexuality is a genuine sexual orientation, a natural way of being, not some kind of problem to be fixed.
Yes, this is absolutely crucial to understand, both for individuals identifying this way and for society at large. Asexuality is generally understood as a natural, inherent lack of sexual attraction or desire towards anyone. It's not an illness. It's not usually the result of trauma, though trauma can impact sexuality in other ways. It's not something to be fixed or treated through therapy or medical intervention as if it's a disorder. It's simply a different point on the broad spectrum of human sexual orientation.
And it's distinct from aromanticism, right? Which is a lack of romantic attraction or desire. You can be asexual but not aromantic, meaning you desire romantic connection but not sex, or vice versa, or both, or neither.
Correct. Both asexuality and aromanticism are valid, normal states of being. The friend's story you shared from the sources is a powerful, really beautiful illustration of this.
Yeah, tell us about that.
An asexual woman felt immense pressure for years from family, friends, and just societal expectations because her natural lack of sexual desire was constantly perceived as something wrong, a problem with her. She felt broken. In therapy, she finally came to understand her orientation and accept herself fully, which was hugely liberating.
That's wonderful.
And she is happily married, has a deep, close, romantic, and intellectually fulfilling relationship with her husband, but there is simply no sex between them. Her husband, who is not asexual, gets his sexual needs met elsewhere, but with full transparency, open communication, and complete mutual agreement and respect from both partners.
And the source calls that as super cool symbiosis, which I love, based on radical honesty and clear agreements. It just highlights how couples can find these unconventional arrangements that work perfectly for them, prioritizing different needs and forms of connection as long as communication and consent are absolutely central.
It's a truly inspiring example of designing a relationship that fits the individuals involved, rather than trying to force themselves into a traditional mold that simply doesn't fit their authentic selves. However, the sources also rightly caution against misusing terminology. It's important not to just casually label temporary states like low libido due to intense stress or depression or illness as asexual.
Right, that's different.
Nor should we casually use terms like depressed for simply feeling a bit down or sad for a day.
Yeah, like my own anecdote about romanticizing sadness as melancholy when I was younger, until I actually looked up the clinical definition of major depressive disorder and realized how serious and distinct it was from just fleeting sadness or poetic angst. Semantic clarity is really important, especially when we're talking about real psychological or physical conditions and orientations.
Precisely. Using correct terminology for real conditions and orientations is vital for accurate understanding, for self-acceptance, and for effective communication. It's important to understand that within the broad consensual landscape of human sexuality, many diverse expressions are okay, many desires are normal, but also some things simply aren't for everyone, and that is absolutely okay too. You don't have to like everything.
Like the golden shower example from the sources, a specific sexual practice involving urine.
Yes. It's okay if that is something a partner desires and is seeking to explore consensually with someone. But it is absolutely okay if that specific practice is not for you, if it causes you disgust or discomfort. Your personal boundaries and preferences are completely valid. And being fundamentally incompatible on deeply desired practices can be a completely valid reason to end a relationship. You should never feel pressured or obligated to do something that causes you genuine discomfort or violates your core boundaries.
But the sources also prompt some valuable self-reflection here too, right? If a partner suggests something outside your current norm, are you saying no immediately because it's truly fundamentally unacceptable to you, a violation of your core boundaries or values? Or is there maybe, just maybe, a suppressed interest, a fear, a lack of understanding, or perhaps a learned inhibition there that could potentially be explored or understood better, even if you still ultimately say no?
Exactly. That's the nuance. If there's potential openness, even a tiny flicker of curiosity behind the initial apprehension, maybe instead of an immediate hard no, the dialogue could be, tell me more about that. What's that about for you? Or let's explore this idea verbally first. Just talk about it, see how it feels just to discuss.
Want to dip your toe in verbally first?
Right. But acknowledging honestly that some things just cause genuine fundamental disgust or revulsion, not arousal, is also perfectly okay. You don't have to intellectualize away genuine discomfort or pretend to be open to something you truly are not. Your gut reaction is valid data too.
I had an experience like that recently, actually, where a partner suggested something, and it just wasn't for me. It caused that immediate gut sense of, nope, not interested.
Yeah.
But instead of just shutting the conversation down, I felt comfortable enough to say, that specific thing isn't really for me. It just doesn't resonate. And then I was able to suggest some alternative ideas, other things I was curious about that maybe we both might enjoy exploring instead.
Which is exactly that excellent communication in action. It honors your boundary clearly, but keeps the door open for shared exploration of other possibilities. It's constructive. But initiating these conversations, whether it's about fantasies, desires, boundaries, or discomforts, is genuinely hard for many people.
Oh, tell me about it. My experience in that past relationship where sex was this completely taboo, unspeakable topic. Trying to even start that conversation felt like trying to push through a solid brick wall. It was met with such resistance, such intense awkwardness, that it really highlighted how incredibly difficult it can be when a partner is unwilling or just unable to engage on this level.
There are so many difficult emotions tangled up in trying to initiate these talks, or even just in being vulnerable enough to share your inner sexual world. Fear of losing the partner is huge, fear of rejection. Will they think less of me? Will they leave me? Just difficulty finding the right words to convey complex thoughts and feelings, maybe existing emotional distance in the relationship, and certainly a deep-seated fear of judgment. What will they think of me if I admit I fantasize about that?
So creating maximum psychological safety in the conversation itself is absolutely paramount. You have to feel safe to even start.
Absolutely. Maximum safety. Agreeing explicitly beforehand. Okay, we're going to talk about some sensitive things now. And we agree, promise, not to judge each other, just to listen and try to understand. The three sexual fantasies exercise we mentioned earlier is specifically designed with that kind of safe, structured exploration in mind to lower the barrier.
And the sources mention a truly crucial point from your psychological perspective that resonates so deeply with my own personal experience. The body doesn't lie.
It's fundamental. Our minds can rationalize things away. Our feelings can be confusing or contradictory. We can even tell ourselves stories or actively suppress uncomfortable truths. But the body and its physical responses, tension, pain, pleasure, avoidance, provides a much more honest, direct signal about what's really going on for us. Learning to tune into and synchronize your mind, your feelings, and your body sensations is absolutely vital for genuine sexual well-being and overall health.
I experienced that so directly and painfully in my past. Consistently agreeing to sex I didn't truly want, maybe because I was stressed or tired or just unable to say no because of that old good girl syndrome, feeling obligated, or that pervasive damaging idea of marital duty actually manifested as recurring physical gynecological problems for me.
Oh, wow.
My body was literally reacting negatively, creating physical symptoms because I was overriding my own desires, my own sense of safety, my own boundaries. I was holding on to so much internal conflict and tension, and it came out physically.
That is a classic textbook example of psychosomatic expression, the body manifesting psychological distress or internal conflict. Your body was quite literally screaming out the no that you perhaps couldn't vocalize emotionally or psychologically at the time.
Exactly. And it highlights the incredible importance of a partner being attuned and actually asking about your readiness or mood like my current husband does. It's not just about being polite. It's essential for respectful, consensual, and truly healthy intimacy. Because we communicate openly now, because we value mutual well-being and comfort, those conversations about how we're feeling, what we're needing, they happen naturally now, usually without fear.
And your experience and the sources really pose that critical, maybe uncomfortable question to listeners. If you genuinely fear your partner's reaction to you saying no, to you expressing a boundary or a differing desire, why are you in that relationship? That fear itself is such a powerful sign that something is fundamentally unhealthy or unsafe in the dynamic and really needs to be addressed, potentially with professional help.
That's a hard question, but a necessary one. Moving beyond just physical arousal zones, the sources also mention things like sapiosexuality, being aroused primarily by intellect, by someone's mind and ideas.
Yes, another great example of how arousal zones and what draws us in can be incredibly diverse, extending far beyond the purely physical or even just the emotional connection. The goal in sexual interactions, and ideally in intimate relationships more broadly, shouldn't just be using the head, like intellectualizing sex, focusing only on mechanics or performance, or just using the body in a detached, purely physical way.
Right, not compartmentalizing.
It's about striving for wholeness, integrating your feelings, your body sensations and desires, and your mind, your ideas, thoughts, fascinations, personality, humor.
Because often people limit themselves, right? They might have relationships that are primarily just about sex with no deeper emotional or intellectual connection, or just about intense emotional connection with zero physical intimacy, or purely intellectual friendships with no physical or emotional depth. They keep things separate.
Exactly. But the sources and generally accepted psychological health models suggest seeking integration, where all these aspects, mind, body, heart, are present, valued, and interconnected in intimacy. This usually leads to a much richer, more fulfilling experience of being fully alive and connected both to yourself and to another person.
This reminds me of Nadia Kaversky's idea from the source material, which really resonated with me, that sexual energy or tension you sometimes feel towards someone isn't only and exclusively about wanting to have sex with them.
Right.
It can also be about the potential for shared creation, shared projects, or other forms of passionate connection or collaboration.
Ah, yes. Sublimation in action. That's the psychological term for it. Channeling that libido, that powerful psychic energy and drive into non-sexual, productive, or creative outlets. It's a conscious redirecting of that fundamental energy.
I can totally relate to that. I have friends, colleagues even, who I felt that initial sexual flare with, that undeniable spark of attraction or intense energy when we first met. But it didn't lead to sex, nor did I necessarily want it to with those specific people in that context. Instead, we ended up collaborating intensely on creative projects, maybe building businesses together, or forging these incredibly strong, deep, platonic friendships. It felt like that initial powerful energy was acknowledged, respected, and then consciously channeled into something else entirely, something productive and connecting.
That is precisely sublimation. It's a sophisticated psychological mechanism and often a conscious choice to take that powerful fuel, that libido directed towards another person, and redirect it into building something, creating something, connecting on a different plane.
Hmm.
Think of the analogy we used earlier. You can appreciate the beauty and energy of many flowers in a garden, feel drawn to them, admire them, but you don't need to pick every single one or try to consume them all. You can appreciate that energy, acknowledge it within yourself, and then channel it consciously into tending the garden itself, perhaps, or painting the flowers, or writing about them.
It's about recognizing the energy for what is powerful fuel and then choosing consciously where to direct it for your well-being and growth and the well-being of your relationships.
Exactly. It broadens the possibilities of how you can interact with and utilize that fundamental life force that drives us.
Okay, let's try to pull all these amazing threads together as we start to wrap up this deep dive. It really sounds like sexuality is fundamentally a skill we learn and also a powerful form of energy we manage.
It absolutely is a skill.
Hmm.
And like any complex skill, learning an instrument, mastering a sport, becoming fluent in a new language, it requires exploration, practice, experience, and crucially, ongoing communication throughout your entire life. Your body changes, your desires change, your needs change. Just like your food preferences might change dramatically over decades, it's not static.
So it's really about maintaining a conscious, exploratory perspective on your own sexuality and your intimate connections, always being curious.
Yes. And constantly returning to those core themes we discussed. Building a culture of consent where intimacy is always an invitation, never an expectation, where both partners have full agency and feel safe to say yes or no without repercussions. Not bringing preconceived expectations or baggage into new relationships based on past experiences. Oh, nobody will ever want this part of me. But instead being brave enough to openly talk about desires and boundaries from the beginning.
For someone listening who feels really uncomfortable with all this, maybe blocked by past experiences or just completely doesn't know where to even start this exploration, what are some small, concrete steps they could take, like baby steps?
Great question. The sources strongly suggest starting with self-exploration. Especially for women who are often culturally disconnected from their own bodies, simply understanding your own physical self is crucial. Like literally looking in the mirror to see your anatomy, understanding that bodies are diverse and yours is okay, exploring sensation on your own skin. Solo exploration is incredibly important and often underrated.
Like masturbation.
Yes, masturbation, self-touch. Sex toys are often recommended not just for pleasure, but explicitly as tools for self-discovery, helping you learn what feels good to you in your own body at your own pace, without any pressure from a partner.
Just asking yourself those simple, maybe slightly scary questions. What do I actually like in sex? What feels good to my body physically? How do I perceive my own sexuality right now, today? Do I even feel sexual?
And being radically honest with yourself about the answers, even if there's confusion or shame or fear attached to them. That honesty, just acknowledging where you are right now, is the absolute first step towards freedom and change.
Which touches on another really profound point from the sources: the importance of accepting yourself as a sexual being in the first place.
Yes. Connecting sexuality as a basic need, as we discussed, also requires the awareness and acceptance of oneself as a sexual object. And I don't mean that in a victimized or objectified sense, but in a healthy, empowered way. Recognizing your own capacity for desire, for pleasure, for attraction, and accepting that as a natural, normal, integral part of who you are as a human being. This self-acceptance is often the first and sometimes the biggest crucial challenge to overcome. Don't lose touch with your own sexuality by hiding it away or pretending it doesn't exist.
And for people who are carrying negative past experiences, whether that's individual sexual trauma or maybe just painful relationship histories that really impacted their sexuality,
Yeah.
can that fear and pain truly be overcome? Is it possible to heal?
Absolutely. The sources are very clear and ultimately hopeful on this. Negative experiences can be overcome. Fear is reduced, not by avoiding the topic or avoiding intimacy, but by carefully, safely getting new, positive, quality experiences that gradually overwrite the old pain pathways in the brain.
So new positive experiences are key.
Yes. But the difficult part is you often have to be vulnerable enough, brave enough to go into it, meaning brave enough to seek out those safe, positive experiences, perhaps with a trusted partner or therapist, even when fear is still present, in order to reduce the hold that the fear built from the negative ones has on you. It takes courage.
And sometimes missing an ex-partner, for example, might not actually be about missing that specific person so much as missing the way they perhaps met certain needs in your life at that time, whether those were sexual, emotional, or intellectual needs that are currently unmet.
Yes, exactly. That directed libido, that energy still pointing towards the past. Addressing the lack in your present life, perhaps seeking out new connections, finding fulfilling creative outlets, intentionally building intimacy with a current partner if you have one, helps redirect that energy forward and facilitates healing and moving on.
And finally, it feels really important just to normalize the conversation itself. I've certainly faced pushback or awkward jokes sometimes from friends when I try to talk about sex openly. Things like, whoa, why are you talking about that? Are you lacking sex or something? Like it's inappropriate.
That reaction is almost always about their discomfort, their own conditioning, not yours. Encourage open, honest talk about sex, just like you would any other important aspect of life or relationships. Even if others are uncomfortable initially with inappropriate boundaries, of course, we're not talking about being crude or violating anyone's space. The more we talk about it calmly and respectfully, the more normal it becomes. It's just another topic of conversation, like talking about your work, your health, your feelings, or your relationships, because it is deeply intertwined with all of those things.
So the encouragement really is to know yourself, accept yourself, understand your own energy, talk about sex, explore what brings you pleasure.
Seek orgasms, prioritize your pleasure, and live a happy, full, integrated life where your sexuality is a source of joy, connection, and vitality, not shame, confusion, or silence.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe, just maybe, as a final provocative thought to leave you with, drawing on that really interesting idea of channeling sexual energy, could you, maybe starting today, explore some new ways to consciously direct that powerful, vital energy, that potential sexual tension or initial spark you feel towards someone or something into creative or productive outlets in your life, turning that potent fuel into something entirely new, something that builds or creates or connects in a different way? What might happen if you truly embrace that energy and tried to consciously channel it differently?
It's a fascinating way of looking at that powerful force we all carry within us, not just for reproduction or pleasure, though those are important, but as a fundamental drive for life itself, for creation, for connection in all its forms.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive into adult sex education. We really hope it was useful, maybe thought-provoking, and perhaps even a little liberating for you.